For 8 years, the most dangerous man on Detroit's east side bankrolled a community center in the poorest neighborhood in the city. 8 years, and he never once walked through its doors. Nobody understood why. People in the neighborhood whispered it was money laundering. His own men figured it was just another one of the boss's strange habits. The truth belonged to only one person, an elderly woman who managed the place, who received a thick envelope every month and never asked a single question. Then came a night in October. A woman stood outside the center's entrance. No money, no family, nowhere left in the world to go. The old manager opened the door and let her in, without asking why. She had no idea who was behind this place. He had no idea she existed. But when these two people crossed paths, she would uncover the one thing he had buried the deepest, and he would have to choose between the empire he had built and the man he had left behind. If you want to find out what happens when someone with nothing meets someone who has lost himself, stay until the end. Hit that like button, share this video with a friend, and subscribe so you never miss another story. Josie set her only bag down at the edge of the bed, a narrow single pressed against the wall, the blanket thin but clean, the pillow still carrying the faint scent of cheap soap. The room was just large enough for one person to turn in place, a narrow window looking out onto the alley behind the building. There were no paintings, no mirror, nothing but 4 white walls that had yellowed with time, but it was clean. Someone had wiped this room down before she arrived, even though they hadn't known she would. The manager stood in the doorway, her arms folded across her chest, watching Josie with eyes that were used to seeing people come and go. "The rules here are simple," she said. "If you stay, you help out. Don't ask about other people. Don't bring trouble back with you. If you can do that, you stay. If you can't, you leave." Josie looked at her. "Where do I start?" Rosa tilted her head slightly. That wasn't a question she usually heard. Most people who came here asked when they could leave, what they would be fed, how long they could stay. No one asked where to begin. The shared kitchen needs cleaning. The faucet has been leaking for 2 weeks, and no one has fixed it. The storage room looks like a battlefield. Josie nodded. She didn't thank her, didn't complain. She took off her coat, rolled up her sleeves, and stepped out of the room. Rosa lingered for a moment, watching her go, then turned away, her mouth saying nothing but her eyes already saying enough. The next morning, Rosa came to the shared kitchen at 6 o'clock, as she did every day. But the lights were already on. Josie lay on her back beneath the sink, a wrench in her hand, sweat dripping onto the tiles. The faucet that had leaked for 2 weeks had stopped. Rosa stood at the kitchen doorway, a cup of tea in her hand, and said nothing. She just watched. Josie slid out from under the sink, wiped her hands on her pants, and saw Rosa. "The faucet is done. The drain pipe under the sink was clogged. I cleared that too. The gasket needs replacing, but tape will hold for a few weeks." Rosa took a sip of tea. "Where did you learn plumbing?" "In a lot of places." Rosa didn't ask anything more. She had already said the rules. Don't ask about other people. From that day on, Josie wasn't someone staying on charity. She became the one who fixed everything. The hinge on the common room door had been creaking for 2 months. Josie fixed it in a single afternoon. The storage room that had been piled into chaos for years, she cleared it in 3 days, sorting, labeling, placing everything back on shelves in order. The bulletin board in the hallway had been empty. She wrote out the schedule, meal times, emergency numbers, and pinned them up neatly. She didn't talk much. She didn't tell her story. She didn't ask about anyone else. She just worked, and people began to notice. A middle-aged man living in the last room at the end of the hall started helping her carry things. A young woman upstairs began cleaning her own room more carefully after seeing Josie clean the kitchen. No one said it out loud, but something shifted in the way people moved through that place. Lighter, less guarded. Josie didn't lead anyone. She simply did what needed to be done, and others chose for themselves whether to follow. 2 weeks later, Rosa sat in her small office, a tiny room that barely held a desk and a chair. She picked up the phone and dialed the only number she had been told to call if anything ever came up. Walsh answered after 2 rings. "Is something wrong, Rosa?" "Nothing's wrong. I just want to say one thing." "Go on." Rosa looked out into the hallway, where Josie was fixing a loose ceiling light. Standing on a folding chair, she had repaired the leg of the day before. "There's someone new," Rosa said. "She's different." Walsh was silent for a moment. "Different how?" "The kind that makes me think she won't leave." Walsh didn't respond. He hung up, and Rosa returned to her work, not knowing that the brief call would reach the ears of a man she had served for 8 years but had never once met. 12 blocks away, on the top floor of a restaurant whose menu carried no prices, Merritt Kane sat at the head of the table in a VIP room where golden light spilled down across the polished surface of dark oak. 5 men sat around the table. No one spoke. The glass of wine in front of Merritt hadn't been touched, and it wouldn't be touched until the boss decided that this evening was over. That was the kind of power no one in the room dared to challenge. Not because Merritt had ever done anything to them, but because they knew he could do anything. And the most frightening part was that they wouldn't see it coming. The man seated on the left, a salt and pepper-haired figure in a wrinkled white shirt, swallowed and spoke first. The shipment from last week was held at the port. Our people said there was a problem with the paperwork. The other side is demanding an extra 20% to let it through. Silence. Merritt didn't look at the man who had spoken. He looked at the wine glass, his index finger tapping the table once. Only once. Change ports. Use the northern route. Anyone who won't comply gets replaced. 9 words. No explanation. No discussion. Not a second of hesitation. The salt and pepper-haired man opened his mouth as if to ask more, but the man beside him placed a hand on his arm and gave a slight shake of his head. Don't. The boss had spoken. That was enough. The 5 men rose almost at the same moment, their chairs making no sound across the wooden floor because the carpet was too thick. They left the room in order, each one nodding as he passed Merritt, but none of them stopped. The door closed softly, like a breath. Walsh didn't leave. He remained seated at the far end of the table, his back against the chair, both hands resting on his thighs, waiting. Walsh always waited. He had sat in that seat for 8 years, and in those 8 years, he had never once left before Merritt allowed it. "This month's money has been sent," Walsh said, his voice as calm as if he were giving the weather. Rosa confirmed that she received it. Merritt nodded, a nod that didn't require him to look up. Walsh was quiet for a beat, then continued, more carefully this time. "Rosa called this afternoon. There's someone new at the center. She says this woman is changing everything inside." Merritt didn't react. His face remained still, as water no one dared throw a stone into. Changing it how? Repairs, cleaning, reorganizing. Rosa says she's different from the others before her. The silence stretched on. Walsh knew this kind of silence. It meant Merritt was thinking, and when Merritt was thinking, no one should interrupt. "Leave it alone," Merritt said. "Don't touch it." Walsh nodded. He didn't ask anything more. Over the past 8 years, he had learned that the subject of the community center was ground that even the closest man shouldn't step onto. Merritt paid for that place every month, as regularly as if he were paying off a debt, but he never explained why. Walsh didn't ask, not because he was afraid, but because he knew the answer lay somewhere deep inside Merritt, in a place Merritt himself didn't want to touch. Walsh stood, fastened the button of his suit jacket again, and walked out of the room. The door closed a second time. Merritt sat alone. The VIP room suddenly felt larger, with only one man left in it. He looked at the wine glass in front of him, then looked out the window. From this height, the city of Detroit spread below like a map of light. To the west was the bright blaze of downtown. To the east, where the lights thinned and the darkness grew heavier, was the east side. Merritt knew exactly where the center building stood in that dark stretch. He had always known, the way a person always knows where an old scar lies on the body, even when they never want to look at it. He sat that way for a long time. The wine glass still hadn't been touched. Then Merritt stood, put on his coat, and left the restaurant without looking back. His car turned west, not east, never east. 2 weeks after Rosa's call, Walsh's phone rang at 2 o'clock in the morning. It wasn't Rosa. It was the hospital. Rosa had been admitted to emergency care, heart-related. She was lying in intensive care, and no one knew when she would wake up. Walsh sat up in bed, switched on the light, and called Merritt at once, not because Rosa was sick, but because the center had 3 contracts that had to be signed within 48 hours. Electricity, water, insurance. Every one of them carried the name of the building's owner. Every one of them required the signature of Merritt Kane. If they weren't signed on time, the center would lose service. Rosa was the only person who normally handled paperwork for Merritt on a regular basis, under power of attorney. Now Rosa was in the hospital. The authorization couldn't be used. There was only one way left. Merritt listened. Then he was silent for a long moment. Walsh waited. He knew this silence wasn't hesitation. It was calculation. What time does it open? 6 in the morning. But the residents are in there all night. Be there at 6. Bring the paperwork. Walsh ended the call and understood that tomorrow would be the first time in 8 years his boss would set foot inside the building he paid to keep alive every month. Early that morning, 3 men stepped out of the black car parked in front of the center. Merritt walked in the middle, Walsh on his right, another man on his left. Merritt wore a dark coat, moved slowly, his eyes passing over the front of the building as if reading something only he could understand. 8 years. The building was still standing there, but something was different. The glass doors had been cleaned. The front steps no longer held trash. The sign with the center's name had been straightened and secured back into place, where before it had hung crooked to one side. Merritt pushed the door open and walked in. Inside, he stopped, not because he was surprised, but because this place didn't look like what he remembered. Cleaner, more ordered. Supply shelves had been arranged and labeled. The hallway had been mopped, the walls repainted where the plaster had peeled. Someone had given a great deal of time to this place, and Merritt knew that someone wasn't Rosa. The footsteps of the 3 men echoed across the tiled floor in the early morning. The residents upstairs began to wake. One man opened his door, looked out, saw the 3 figures in the hallway, and shut it again at once. A woman leading her child to the bathroom saw Walsh, turned around, and pulled the little one the other way. They recognized this kind of man. No one had to explain it. The clothes, the way they walked, the way they stood, everything said the same thing. Stay away. But one person didn't stay away. Josie stepped out of the shared kitchen, a steaming cup of coffee in her hand, her eyes fixed directly on the 3 men standing in the middle of the hall. She didn't step back. She didn't lower her head. She didn't look away. Who are you, and what do you need here? Walsh took one step forward, by instinct, in the way he always did whenever someone spoke to the boss without permission. But Merritt lifted his left hand, just a small gesture, level with his waist, light as if brushing dust aside. Walsh stopped at once, as if nailed to the floor. Josie saw that gesture. She saw Walsh freeze. Then she looked back at Merritt. Her eyes didn't change. No fear, no impression. She was only waiting for an answer. Merritt looked at her. This was the first time he had seen Josie Warren, and he looked at her the way a man accustomed to judging everything within 3 seconds would look. But 3 seconds passed, and he still hadn't placed her into any category he knew. I need to sign paperwork. Where is Rosa? She's in the hospital. Who are you that you need to sign paperwork for this place? I'm the owner of the building. Josie tilted her head slightly. For 8 years, I've heard this place had an owner nobody ever saw. Today, the owner shows up because of paperwork. Because of paperwork, Merritt said, his voice flat. Take me to the office. Josie didn't move. Answer my question first. Did you come here because of paperwork, or because Rosa is in the hospital? Silence. Walsh looked at Merritt. Merritt looked at Josie. And in that silence, something happened that both of them felt, but neither of them spoke aloud. She wasn't afraid of him, not because she was brave, but because she had been in places where fear no longer meant anything. Where is the office? Merritt asked again, his voice unchanged. Josie looked at him for 1 beat longer, then she turned and walked, leading him to the small room at the end of the hallway that Rosa used as an office. Merritt sat down in the chair, opened the file case Walsh had brought, skimmed each page quickly, and signed. He didn't ask questions. He didn't check anything. He knew the contents of these contracts, even though he hadn't seen them in 8 years. The pen moved quickly, neatly, his signature small but decisive. Done. Merritt stood, handed the case back to Walsh, and walked out of the office. He moved down the hallway toward the front door, his steps even, without looking back. Walsh and the other man followed. But before stepping through the door, Merritt stopped. He didn't fully turn around. He only glanced back toward the hallway. Josie was standing there. Her arms were folded across her chest. The coffee cup had been set down somewhere. Her eyes were still on him, unblinking, unwavering. Merritt turned away and stepped outside. The door closed behind him. The black car drove off, dissolving into the early morning traffic of the city. Josie remained alone in the hallway, staring at the closed door. She didn't know who that man was, but she knew one thing. He had owned this building for 8 years, and had only come today. And when he looked around this place, his eyes hadn't looked like the eyes of a property owner inspecting an asset. They had looked like the eyes of a man seeing again something he had tried to forget. 1 week after the day that man came and left, Josie still knew nothing more about him. She asked the residents, and no one knew. Or no one dared to speak. The name on the paperwork was Merritt Kane, but that name wasn't tied to any face in the memory of anyone at the center. He was like a ghost, who owned a building he had never wanted to live in. Josie didn't ask any more questions. She went back to work. The list of things that needed fixing was still long, and the next item was the plumbing system in the basement. There was a leak somewhere down below. Water seeped up onto the ground floor every time it rained, leaving a damp stain of mildew in the corner of the hallway that no one had bothered to deal with. Josie carried her toolbox down to the basement in the afternoon. The basement was dark, the ceiling low, the fluorescent light flickering as if it were about to die. She traced the leak along the main pipe, crawled beneath the line, tightened the joint, replaced the rubber seal. It was familiar work. Her hands moved without needing her mind. She went farther in, toward the far end of the basement, following the pipe to the last wall. And there, behind an old iron shelf stacked with wet cardboard boxes, was an iron door. Smaller than a normal room door, secured with a rusted padlock, the kind of old lock people didn't sell anymore. Josie stood in front of that door for a while. She looked at the lock, looked at the dust on the handle, looked at the way the door sat recessed into the wall, as if someone had wanted it to disappear. She went back upstairs and asked a few people. No one knew what that room held. An old man who had lived at the center longer than anyone said he had never seen anyone open that door. "It was locked before I got here," he said. "Probably an old storage room." Josie went back to Rosa's office. Rosa was still in the hospital. The office was locked, but Josie had the key to the room because she was handling Rosa's daily paperwork in her place. She opened the desk drawer and searched through the tools Rosa had left behind. Inside was a ring of old keys, 6 of them, linked together on a rusted steel loop. No labels. No one knew which key opened what. Josie took the ring downstairs to the basement. The first key didn't fit. The second went in but wouldn't turn. The third made a sharp crack, and the lock opened, heavy and reluctant, like something that didn't want to be awakened. She pushed the door. The hinge gave a long screech in the darkness. Inside wasn't a storage room. It was a small chamber with a low ceiling and no window. Dust covered every surface, but beneath the dust everything had been arranged with a neatness so exact it felt almost obsessive. Iron shelves ran along both walls, packed with books. Not ordinary books, law books. Dozens of them, thick spines, embossed titles faded with time. Beneath the shelves were cardboard boxes, stacked one atop another, each labeled by hand in black ink. Merritt Kane-esque. Josie stood in the middle of the room, her eyes moving from the shelves to the boxes to the wall at the back. On the wall hung a framed diploma in a wooden frame, dusty but still legible. University of Michigan, Juris Doctor. The name on the diploma, Merritt Kane. Beside the diploma was a photograph. A young man, maybe in his late 20s, wearing a dark blue suit, standing in front of the entrance to a federal building. He was smiling, not a strained smile, but a real one. His eyes bright, his shoulders straight, like a man who believed the world was waiting for him. Josie looked at that photograph for a long time. She recognized the face. The same lines, the same square jaw, the same eyes. But the man in the photograph and the man who had come to sign the papers the week before were 2 different human beings. The man in the photograph still believed in something. The man from last week didn't. She sat down on the floor and opened one of the boxes. Inside were case files, hundreds of pages. Complaints, transcripts, briefs, a lawsuit defending the rights of an immigrant labor community being forcibly displaced to make way for a commercial development. Merritt Kane stood for the plaintiffs, the attorney representing 300 people who were about to lose their homes. Josie turned to the last page. The ruling. Complaint dismissed. Lost completely. She closed the box again, sat still in the dark room, surrounded by dust and law books and the files of a life the owner had locked away beneath the basement. The most dangerous mafia boss on the east side of Detroit had once been a civil rights lawyer. He had once stood before a federal courthouse and smiled like a man who believed justice was real. Then he lost, and he buried all of it down here, locked it away, and never came back. Josie stood up, walked out of the room, closed the iron door, locked the padlock, slipped the key into her pocket. She didn't tell anyone. Not one person at the center knew what she had just seen, but when she climbed the stairs back up to the ground floor, something in her eyes had changed. It wasn't pity. Josie Warren didn't know pity. It was anger. The kind of anger only someone who had once seen another person possess something precious and then throw it away could understand. She had grown up with nothing. No family, no degree, no one to teach her that she deserved anything. And that man had had everything. Knowledge, ability, an entire life that could have been spent protecting the weak. Then he had locked it away in the basement and become the very thing he had once fought against. Josie tightened her grip on the key in her pocket. She still didn't know what she was going to do with what she had found. But she knew one thing. She wouldn't leave it alone. Josie spent 3 days finding Walsh's number. She went through the contact notebook Rosa had left behind and found only one number written in pencil, with no name, sitting on the last page like something Rosa had tried to hide but hadn't dared erase. Josie called. Walsh answered after 4 rings. "I'm Josie, the one managing the center in Rosa's place. I need to meet the owner of the building." Walsh paused for a beat. "For what reason?" "Facilities. There's an issue in the basement I can't decide on my own. It requires the owner's signature and approval. I can pass along the message. No, I need to meet him directly." Walsh was silent longer this time. Josie could hear him breathing faintly on the other end, the kind of breath of a man weighing whether to say yes or no. "I'll ask him. If he agrees, I'll call you back." Walsh called back 6 hours later. A small cafe in Corktown, 20 minutes by car from the center. 20 minutes from Merritt's restaurant as well. Neutral ground. 10 in the morning tomorrow. Josie arrived 10 minutes early. The cafe was quiet, only 2 tables occupied. She chose a table in the back corner, her back to the wall, her face toward the door. Not because she was afraid, but because she wanted to see him walk in. Merritt arrived exactly on time, alone. Walsh waited outside in the car. He stepped into the cafe, his eyes sweeping the room once before finding Josie. He walked over, pulled out a chair, and sat down. No greeting, no order. He simply sat and looked at her with the same eyes Josie had seen in the hallway at the center the week before, the kind of eyes used to people looking down first. "You said there's a problem in the basement." Josie didn't circle around it. She placed both hands on the table and looked straight into his eyes. "I know who you used to be." Silence. Merritt didn't move. He didn't blink, but something tightened along his jaw. Just slightly, almost invisible. But Josie saw it. "I found the room in the basement. Law books, case files, the diploma on the wall." Merritt sat still for another beat. Then he spoke, his voice flat, but lower than before by half a tone. "You don't have the right to go through my property. I wasn't going through anything. I was fixing the plumbing. The room was right there, and you unlocked it, with Rosa's keys. I'm managing the place in her absence. I need to know what every room in the building holds. Now you know. So what's the facilities issue?" "There is no facilities issue. I needed to meet you." Merritt leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You lied to Walsh to arrange this meeting. I did what I had to do to sit here. The same way you do what you have to do to pay for that center every month without ever stepping inside." The silence grew heavier. Behind the bar, the bartender was wiping a glass, the sound of glass against cloth clear and sharp. "What do you want, Josie?" She heard her name in his mouth and knew he had looked into her after their first meeting at the center. That didn't surprise her. "I want to know why a man who once stood in a federal court defending 300 people about to lose their homes became what you are now." Merritt didn't answer immediately. He looked at her, and in his eyes there was something Josie hadn't expected. Not anger. Weariness. The kind of weariness of a man who had asked himself that question 1,000 times and had never found an answer light enough to carry. "You're staying in my building," he said, each word clear like a verdict. "Don't confuse that with the right to judge me. I'm not judging you. Then what are you doing?" Josie leaned forward. "I see a man running from the best version of himself, and I see that as the worst kind of waste I've ever witnessed." That hit. Josie knew it hit because Merritt didn't react. When he was angry, he spoke. When he was struck in the right place, he went silent. And he was silent now. Merritt stood up. The chair scraped lightly across the tile floor. He looked down at Josie. His eyes closed off like the basement door she had just opened. "Don't go into that room again." Then he turned his back and walked out of the cafe. The glass door shut behind him. Josie remained seated alone, looking at the cup of coffee he had never ordered. Outside, Walsh stood by the car and opened the door when Merritt approached. "How was the meeting?" Merritt didn't answer. He got into the back seat and closed the door. Walsh walked around to the driver's side, got in, and waited. Silence stretched inside the car. Walsh looked into the rearview mirror. Merritt sat motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead but seeing nothing. His right hand was clenched on his thigh, the knuckles pale. 1 minute, 2 minutes. "Drive," Merritt said. Walsh started the engine. The car pulled out of the lot, and for the entire ride back, Merritt Kane didn't say another word. 2 weeks passed, and nothing happened. Merritt didn't make contact. Walsh didn't call. Josie kept working at the center as if the meeting at the cafe had never taken place. She visited Rosa in the hospital twice a week, bringing papers that needed signing, telling her the center was running smoothly. Rosa nodded, her eyes tired but at ease. Josie didn't ask Rosa about Merritt. Not yet. Then, on a Tuesday morning, another black car pulled up in front of the center. But this car was a different kind. Shinier, newer, so clean it looked out of place on a street full of potholes. 2 men stepped out first, each carrying a brown leather briefcase. Then the back door opened, and Nolan Ford got out. Ford wore a gray suit tailored so precisely that every seam seemed exact, shoes polished to reflect the morning light. He looked at the center building with a gentle smile, the kind of smile a man wears when he is looking at something in a store and has already decided to buy it before walking in. Josie saw them from the kitchen window. She wiped her hands on a towel, stepped out the front door, and stood on the front steps with her arms folded across her chest. A familiar place, a familiar stance. Ford walked up the steps, his smile unchanged. "Good morning. I'm looking for the person in charge here. You're looking at her. Wonderful." Ford held out his hand. Josie didn't offer hers. Ford lowered his hand and still didn't lose the smile. This was the kind of man who didn't let rudeness throw off his rhythm. "Nolan Ford, CEO of Creston Development. Perhaps we can speak inside. We can speak here." Ford glanced at the street, the 2 men with briefcases waiting behind him. Then he gave a slight nod, accepting the rules of the game. Creston Development is carrying out an urban development project for the east side. The entire area is going to be rezoned. Modern housing, retail centers, new infrastructure. This is a major opportunity for the whole community, and this building is inside the redevelopment zone. Ford tilted his head, impressed. "You catch on quickly." "Yes. We're prepared to offer fair compensation for every property in the area, including this building. This place isn't mine. I don't have the right to sell it. I know who this place belongs to." Ford said that lightly, but Josie heard the weight underneath it. He knew. He knew who the owner was, and he had come here first not because he needed to speak with her, but because he wanted her to know he was coming. "I only want to make sure all parties understand the choices in front of them." "That sounds like a threat, Mr. Ford." "Just information, miss." He stopped, waiting for her to give her name. Josie didn't. She looked straight into Ford's eyes and saw something she had seen in many people before, the confidence of someone who believed money could buy every conversation. Ford didn't wait any longer. He pulled a business card from the inside pocket of his suit and set it on the railing of the front steps. "Whenever the owner wants to talk, call me. This offer has a time limit, but I'm a patient man." Then he turned away, stepped down from the stoop, and all 3 men got back into the car. The black car drove off, leaving behind nothing but the business card and the scent of expensive cologne the wind hadn't yet carried away. Josie picked up the card. Heavy paper, embossed lettering, corners gilded in gold. She turned it over. Blank. She slipped it into her pocket and went back inside. That afternoon, Josie called Walsh, not to ask for help, but because she knew Walsh would report back to Merritt, and she wanted Merritt to know. A man named Nolan Ford came to the center this morning. Creston Development. They want to buy the building. Walsh was silent for 2 seconds. "What did you say to him?" "I told him this place isn't mine." "Good. Don't say anything more." Walsh hung up. 15 minutes later, he was sitting in the familiar VIP room across from Merritt, repeating everything Josie had just told him. Merritt listened. His face didn't change, but his left hand, resting on the arm of the chair, tightened slowly. "Creston," he said. Only 1 word, but Walsh heard in it an entire history he had never been told. "You know them. Everyone in this world knows Creston. They don't buy, they swallow. Wherever they pass, the community there disappears. It gets replaced by towers and parking lots. What do you want to do? Merritt looked out the window. East. Toward the east side, the same direction he had looked so many times before. But this time there was something different in his eyes. No longer just looking, calculating. Find out everything. What Creston is buying in the east side. Who is behind Ford. What companies the money is moving through. Who at City Hall is approving things for them. I want to know all of it. Walsh nodded and stood. Before leaving, he stopped at the door. Do you want me to tell her anything? Josie. Merritt didn't look at Walsh. No. Walsh left. Merritt remained there alone, for the second time, in the wide and silent VIP room, but this time he didn't look out the window and then turn away. He looked, and kept looking, as if he were trying to see through the darkness of the neighborhood, to find something he had thought he had lost a long time ago. Walsh took a week to dig everything up. What he found wasn't clean. Creston Development wasn't just buying land on the east side. They were swallowing it piece by piece, quietly, through 3 shell companies registered in 3 different states. Each company picked up a few small lots, below market price, from owners who couldn't afford to hire a lawyer to read the contracts. Any resident who refused to sell would receive letters from attorneys, rent hikes, or suddenly discover they were in violation of some clause in their lease that no one had ever mentioned before. Clean on paper, dirty in reality. Walsh placed the full set of documents on the table in front of Merritt. Merritt read each page slowly, his eyes moving across every number, every name, every address. Then he folded the file shut. What's the next major deal? Walsh opened a page. The lot at the corner of Gratiot and Mack. 6,000 square meters. Creston is buying it through a shell company called Lakefront Holdings. The contract is set to be signed this weekend. Who's selling? A family trust. 3 siblings inherited it. 2 want to sell, 1 doesn't. Creston only needs 2 signatures. Merritt tapped his finger on the table once. The one who doesn't want to sell. Connect me to him. 3 days later, the deal collapsed. The third heir withdrew from the agreement and refused to sell. No one knew why he suddenly changed his mind, and he didn't explain. Lakefront Holdings lost the deal. Ford lost money, lost time, lost the most critical parcel in his redevelopment plan, and he had no idea who was behind it. The result showed immediately. Ford disappeared from the east side. For 2 full weeks there were no legal letters, no strangers surveying land, no pressure. The neighborhood grew quiet. Residents breathed easier without understanding why. Then, in the 3rd week, Ford came back, not with a smile and gold-edged business cards. He came back with claws. Residents began receiving legal notices at double the previous rate. Rent spiked suddenly without explanation. A small grocery store at the corner, the only place selling affordable food within a 2-kilometer radius, lost its supplier and had to shut down. An old auto repair shop received a violation notice for building codes that no one had mentioned in 20 years. It all happened at once, as if someone had flipped a switch. Josie saw the pattern. She didn't know the details, but she knew how to read rhythm. Ford disappeared for 2 weeks. Complete silence, then returned twice as aggressive. That kind of disappearance didn't happen because Ford chose to stop. Someone had blocked him, and when he realized he had been blocked, he got angry and took it out on the entire neighborhood. Josie knew only one person capable of doing that. She called Walsh. I need to see him. Today. Walsh didn't ask why. Maybe he had been waiting for this call. They met in the parking lot behind an abandoned supermarket 4 blocks from the center. Merritt leaned against his car, his hands in his coat pockets. Josie walked up, didn't sit, didn't lean, stood directly across from him. What happened 2 weeks ago? Merritt looked at her, didn't answer. Ford disappeared. The whole neighborhood went quiet. Then he came back and doubled the damage. That doesn't happen on its own. Silence. The wind moved through the empty lot, carrying the smell of damp concrete and weeds. You did something, didn't you? Merritt stayed silent, and that silence spoke louder than any answer. Josie stepped forward. You think you're helping. You provoked a beast and let the whole neighborhood take the consequences. The grocery store shut down. Residents are getting threat letters. Rent is going up and no one can afford it. Do you even know that? I'm protecting the building. You're playing a power game. Protection isn't the same as fighting for dominance. You hit Ford once, and he hits back at 100 people who have nothing to do with it. And you call that protection?" Merritt looked at her. His eyes were cold, but not with anger. Cold because he was hearing something he didn't want to hear, but knew was true. "If you keep doing this, you're no different from Ford. You're just stronger. But the way you play is the same. You use people as pieces, make your move, and don't look back to see who falls." Merritt didn't argue. He looked at Josie for another moment, then pushed himself off the car, opened the door, and got in. The door shut. The engine started. He drove away. Josie remained standing in the empty lot, the cold wind cutting through her thin coat. She didn't know if her words had reached him. She only knew she had told the truth, and the truth isn't always welcomed. That night, Walsh sat across from Merritt in the familiar room. Silence had stretched for 10 minutes. "She's not wrong," Walsh said. His voice was quiet. Not advice, just stating what they both already knew. Merritt looked at the glass of wine in front of him. It still hadn't been touched. "I know." Walsh didn't say anything else. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out. The door closed. Merritt remained alone with the untouched glass, and the truth he had known for a long time but had never wanted to hear spoken aloud. 3 days after the meeting in the parking lot, an envelope arrived at the center. No stamp, no postmark. Someone had slipped it directly through the mail slot. Josie picked it up and opened it. Inside was a formal offer from Creston Development, printed on thick paper with the company logo in the upper corner. An offer to buy the building for 3 times the market value. The number was so large that Josie had to read it twice. Tucked with it was a small handwritten note, the script neat, no signature. "This offer remains valid for 30 days. After that, we will find another way." Josie folded the note, slid it back into the envelope, and called Walsh. At that same time, on the other side of the city, Merritt was sitting in a meeting he didn't want to have, not in the familiar VIP room, in an old warehouse on the outskirts, high ceiling, industrial lights casting down over a concrete floor. 3 men sat across from him, not subordinates, partners, men who had shared territory, shared profit, and shared risk with Merritt through the years. The man in the middle, a balding, middle-aged figure named Garza, spoke first. His voice wasn't angry, but it wasn't friendly either. "The deal on the Gratiot lot. You wrecked Creston's transaction." Merritt didn't deny it, didn't confirm it. He just sat there in silence. "The press is digging into the east side, Merritt. Reporters are asking about land transfers, about shell companies. If they dig a little deeper, they'll hit us. All of us." The man on the left nodded. "You're drawing unnecessary attention to an area we need kept quiet." Garza leaned forward. "You're putting all of us at risk over a community center. A community center you don't even set foot in. That is the wrong choice, Merritt." Silence. Merritt looked at the 3 men across from him. He knew they were right. Not right morally, but right logically. In their world, attention was the enemy, and Merritt was bringing that enemy to the door. "Sell the center," Garza said. "Creston is offering triple. Take the money, leave the east side, keep everything quiet." Merritt stood up. "I've heard enough." Then he walked out of the warehouse without another word. Walsh drove in silence. Merritt sat in the back seat, eyes on the window but seeing nothing. He was trapped. In front of him was Ford with the power of a corporation and lawyers and money. Behind him was his own world, where loyalty lasted only until profit was threatened. And he stood in the middle, alone, with an old building in a poor neighborhood that he couldn't explain why he couldn't let go of. "Take me to the center," Merritt said. Walsh glanced into the rearview mirror but didn't ask why. He turned the car east. Merritt entered the center for the second time. This time Walsh didn't go with him, and no one opened the door. He pushed it open himself, walked through the hallway Josie had scrubbed clean, past the bulletin board where she had pinned up the activity schedule, and found her in the shared kitchen. She was washing dishes. Josie turned and looked at him. She looked at that face and saw something she had never seen in Merritt Kane before. Exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of too little sleep. The exhaustion of holding too many things at once and not knowing which one to let fall. "I'm going to sell the building," Merritt said. His voice was flat, but not as steady as it usually was. "Ford is offering 3 times the market value. Enough to open a new center somewhere else." Josie turned off the faucet, dried her hands on a towel, turned fully toward him. "You know that won't happen. Once you sell, it's over. There won't be anywhere else. There won't be a new center." Then it's over. Are you serious? I'm being realistic. Josie stepped closer, not angry. Her voice was so calm, it was almost cold. The last time you fought for something, what happened? Merritt looked at her. His jaw tightened. I lost everything. No. Josie shook her head. You lost once. One single time. Then you ran for 8 years. You didn't lose because you fought, Merritt. You lost because you stopped. The words hung in the air between them. Water dripped from the kitchen faucet that hadn't been shut all the way, one drop at a time, counting out the rhythm of the silence. Merritt didn't answer. He looked at Josie for one long beat more, and in his eyes was a war she couldn't help him with, between the man he had once been and the man he had become, between the basement room full of law books and the VIP room full of silence, between fighting and running. Then he turned and walked out of the kitchen, walked down the hallway, walked through the front door. The door closed behind him. Josie stood alone in the shared kitchen. The faucet still dripped, one drop at a time. She reached out and turned it tight until not one more drop fell. She didn't know whether Merritt Kane would come back or not. She didn't know whether he would sell or stay. She only knew she had said what needed to be said, and now the decision rested in a place she couldn't touch. Outside, the black car left the center, merged into the late afternoon traffic of Detroit, and disappeared. That night, Merritt didn't go home. He sat in his private office, a small room behind a dry cleaning shop he owned on paper, a place no one entered except Walsh. The desk lamp was on, yellow light falling across half his face. The glass of liquor in front of him had been poured but not touched, just like every glass Merritt poured for himself, not to drink, to have something to look at when he didn't want to look at himself. Walsh came a little before 11 o'clock that night. He opened the door without knocking, stepped in, and stood in the doorway. He looked at Merritt sitting there, looked at the untouched glass, looked at the face of a man losing a war no one else could see. She was right, Walsh said. No opening, no lead-in, just the truth. And you know that. Merritt didn't look up. Since when do you defend outsiders? Since the moment an outsider said the thing I didn't dare say. Silence. Merritt kept his eyes on the glass. Walsh stood there a moment longer, then turned and walked out. The door shut softly. His footsteps faded away. Merritt sat alone. The night dragged past hour by hour, slow and heavy. He didn't sleep, didn't read, didn't call anyone. He only sat there and listened to the city outside grow quieter, shifting from noise to distance to complete silence. And in that silence, Josie's voice came back clearer than any other sound. You didn't lose because you fought. You lost because you stopped. The first light of morning slipped through the blinds. Merritt was still sitting in the same place. The glass was still full, but something had changed. Not a decision, not that far yet. Only this: he could no longer bear sitting still. He stood, took his coat, and drove east. Merritt arrived at the center at 7 o'clock in the morning. He didn't call first. He didn't tell Walsh. He pushed the door open and walked in like a man familiar with the place, even though this was only the third time he had ever set foot there. Josie was in the common room, repairing a plywood bookshelf with a broken crossbar. She heard the footsteps, looked up, and saw Merritt standing in the doorway. Her eyes showed no surprise, no pleasure, no anger. She only looked at him and waited. Merritt said nothing. He looked around the room, looked at the broken shelf, looked at the box of nails and the hammer on the floor. Then he walked in, took off his coat and draped it over the back of a chair, sat down on the floor beside Josie, picked up the hammer, and began driving nails into the board she was holding. Josie didn't ask questions. She held the board steady while he hammered. The sound of the hammer echoed through the empty room, steady and sure. They worked in silence, replaced the broken crossbar, tightened the screws, leveled the shelf until it stood straight again. Then, between the blows of the hammer, Merritt spoke. He didn't look at Josie. His eyes stayed on the board in front of him. 10 years ago I took a case. 300 people, an immigrant labor community, about to be forced off their land to make room for a commercial project. They had no money, no lawyer, no one standing with them. The hammer came down, one clean strike. I stood with them. I promised them I would win. I looked each one of them in the eye and told them the law would protect them. The hammer fell again, a second strike. I lost. Lost completely. The court dismissed the case. 300 people lost their homes within 90 days. The hammer stopped. Merritt held it in his hand, eyes lowered to the board, but he wasn't seeing it anymore. There was one family, a husband and wife, and 2 small children. They believed in me most of all. The husband shook my hand before the hearing and said he knew I wouldn't abandon them. Merritt's voice dropped lower, until it was almost only breath with sound. After the ruling, they lost their home. The wife took the children back to her parents, and the husband lost all hope, left the city, and no one ever saw him again. Silence. No more hammer strikes. Only the sound of 2 people breathing in the empty room. I said they believed in me. They did, and I failed. Josie sat still. She didn't say I understand, because she didn't. She didn't say it wasn't your fault, because she didn't know if that was true. She only sat beside him, her back against the bookshelf they had just repaired, and waited. A long while later, she spoke, softly, without pressure, without judgment. You failed once, but you've been hiding for 8 years. Which one is worse? Merritt didn't answer. He set the hammer down on the floor and pushed himself to his feet. His body was rigid, like a man trying to hold himself together before everything inside him collapsed. He stepped toward the door. Josie rose too, and before he could walk out of the room, she reached out and took his hand. She said nothing, didn't pull, didn't hold him back by force. She only held on. Merritt stopped. One foot had already taken half a step toward the doorway, but her hand kept him there. He didn't turn around. He didn't look at her, but he didn't pull his hand away. They stood like that, he facing the door, she just behind him, and between them there were only 2 hands joined in silence. No promise, no confession, nothing except the simplest choice, and the hardest one, to choose not to let go. Outside the window, Detroit was waking up. The sounds of cars, horns, the city beginning a new day. But in the common room of the East Side Center, time stood still, and 2 people who had grown used to walking alone were standing beside each other for the first time without either one leaving first. The next morning, Merritt sat at the table in the center's common room. It was the old wooden table Josie had varnished the week before. Its 4 legs all different heights but steadied with folded cardboard underneath. He sat there as if he had sat there all his life, his back against the chair, both hands resting on the tabletop, looking out toward the hallway window where the residents were beginning to move through the morning. A few of them glanced at him, recognized him, then quietly kept walking. No one asked questions. In this neighborhood, people learned not to ask about things whose answers might bring trouble. Josie stepped out from the shared kitchen carrying 2 cups of coffee. She set one in front of Merritt without asking whether he wanted it, without saying a word, then sat down in the chair across from him with the other cup. Merritt looked at the coffee, looked at Josie. Then he took a drink. It was the first time Josie had ever seen Merritt Kane touch something another person had handed him without checking it first. They sat in silence for a while. The sound of residents moving through the hallway, the kitchen faucet running, someone coughing upstairs, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary place. And the boss of East Detroit sat in the middle of those sounds, for the first time not seeming like an outsider. There was someone I used to know, Merritt said, his eyes on the coffee cup. Back in law school. Kendrick Shaw. He's an investigative journalist now, writes for an independent news outlet. Josie took a sip of coffee and waited. If anyone can dig up Creston's dirty business, it's him. Kendrick isn't afraid of big corporations, and he hates men like Ford. Do you trust him? Merritt thought for a beat. I trust that he hates big corporations more than he hates me. Right now, that's enough. Then contact him. Merritt looked at her. Something almost like half a smile flickered at the corner of his mouth, but it vanished before it could fully form. He pulled out his phone, scrolled through his contacts, and called. No answer. He called again. On the 3rd try, someone picked up. Kendrick, this is Merritt Kane. Silence on the other end. Long silence. Then a low voice, a little rough, came through. Merritt Kane, I heard you were dead. Close enough. Then what realm are you calling me from? From the one that needs your help. The silence this time was shorter. Let's meet. I'll pick the place. They met that afternoon. A small bar in Mexican town, the kind of place where the lights were always dim and the music was always loud enough to keep anyone from hearing the conversation at the next table. Kendrick Shaw was already seated at a table in the back corner, half a glass of beer in front of him and an old battered notebook by his hand. He looked about Merritt's age, but older in the way of men who slept too little and read too much. His eyes were sharp and restless, the kind that missed nothing. Merritt sat down across from him. The two men looked at each other. 8 years. The last time they had spoken was at law school graduation, when both of them had still believed they were going to change the world. "You look different," Kendrick said. "So do you. I just got older. You became someone else." Merritt didn't deny it. He opened the file case Walsh had prepared and set it on the table. "Creston Development is swallowing the east side of Detroit, buying land through shell companies, forcing down prices, using legal tricks to push people out of their homes, and I believe they're bribing city officials to get redevelopment approvals." Kendrick didn't touch the file right away. He looked at Merritt. "Do you have evidence?" "I have leads, names of shell companies, names of officials involved, suspicious money trails. You have the skill and the platform to dig deeper, and you want me to write the story. I want you to find the truth. Whether you write it or not is your decision." Kendrick took a drink of beer, his eyes never leaving Merritt. "Why are you doing this?" "Money. Territory." Merritt was quiet for a beat. "Because there's a community center on the east side that I don't want to lose." Kendrick tilted his head. He looked at Merritt as if trying to find the old friend inside the unfamiliar shell. Then he pulled the file case toward himself, opened it, and began to read. "I'm not promising anything," Kendrick said, his eyes already fixed on the pages. "But if this is real, Creston is about to have a very bad day." Merritt nodded and stood up. "If you need anything else, call Walsh." "Merritt," Kendrick said as he turned away. Merritt stopped. "Welcome back from the dead." Merritt didn't turn around. He walked out of the bar and into the late afternoon sunlight, and for the first time in a very long time, he didn't feel like he was running. He was moving toward something. He still didn't know where it would lead, but at least he was moving. Kendrick worked faster than Merritt had expected. 10 days after their meeting at the bar in Mexican Town, the investigation went live. The headline read, "Creston Development and the Contracts in the Dark." Kendrick wrote with precision. Every section had sources, numbers, names. 3 shell companies registered in 3 different states, all leading back to the same address in Delaware. The East Side redevelopment approvals had been signed in record time, bypassing 3 community impact review steps required by law. 2 officials on the city planning board had received consulting fees from a company that, when traced, belonged to the same network tied to Creston. And the letters pressuring residents to sell their homes had been sent from a law office that was, on paper, unrelated to Creston, yet shared the same mailing address. The article spread fast. Local news sites republished it. 2 television stations in Detroit contacted Kendrick asking for interviews. On social media, the piece was shared thousands of times in the first 2 days. Creston released a press statement on the 3rd day, calling the article unfounded and driven by unclear motives, and declared that the East Side project would proceed in full compliance with the law. Then Ford struck back, not with a press release, with claws. Within a week, everything on the East Side tightened at once. Power at the community center was cut over a technical issue the electric company couldn't explain. Water pressure dropped to almost nothing, the faucets running in little more than drips. The last grocery store still open at the end of the block lost its supplier and hung a closed sign in the window. Residents began receiving letters from lawyers saying their rent was going up or their leases were about to be terminated. It all happened almost at the same time, precise, systematic, like a machine switched on. The first person to come to Josie was Mrs. Morales, who lived on the 2nd floor of the center with her granddaughter. She held a letter from a lawyer in shaking hands. "I support you, Josie, but they say I have to leave in 30 days. I don't have anywhere else to go." Then came Mr. Henderson, the middle-aged man who had helped Josie carry things during her first week there. "The rent on my room outside the neighborhood has gone up by half. I can't afford it." Then another person came, and another. Each one arrived with the same face. Afraid, tired, apologetic. They wanted to stay, but they couldn't. They had lives to protect, bills to pay, things that courage couldn't buy. Josie listened to each of them. She didn't try to keep anyone from leaving. She didn't make promises she couldn't keep. She only nodded and said she understood. Because she truly did. She knew what it felt like to stand between what you wanted and what you had to do. She had lived her whole life that way. Of the 28 people who had supported them at first, fewer than 10 remained. That night, Josie sat alone in the common room. No lights. The power had been cut since afternoon. She sat in the darkness with her back against the bookshelf she and Merritt had repaired together, looking toward the window where the weak flicker of a street lamp spilled in. The center was silent, the kind of silence she recognized, the kind of silence that belongs to a place about to be abandoned. Then came the sound of the front door opening. Familiar footsteps on the tile floor. Merritt walked into the room carrying a small generator, the kind used on construction sites, enough to power a few lights and a refrigerator. Walsh came behind him with a can of gasoline. Merritt set the generator down in the corner of the room, connected the cord, and pulled the starter. The machine coughed, shuddered, then settled into a steady hum. One ceiling light in the common room came on, dim, yellow, but lit. Walsh set the gas can down and stepped back outside. No one had to tell him. He knew when it was time to leave. Josie looked at Merritt in the weak light. He stood beside the generator, oil on his hands, weariness on his face, his coat wrinkled. He didn't look like the boss sitting at the head of the table in the VIP room. He didn't look like the man who made an entire room fall silent when he walked in. He looked like a man trying to keep something from falling apart without knowing whether he was strong enough to hold it. "We're losing," Josie said. It wasn't a complaint, only the truth. Merritt looked at her. The yellow light cast shadow across half his face, while the other half stayed buried in darkness. "We're still standing. That isn't losing." Josie looked at him for another moment. Then she nodded. Only slightly, but enough. That night, for the first time since she had arrived at the center, Josie didn't sleep alone in a dark building. There was light, there was the steady sound of the generator running, and there was a man sitting at the table outside the common room, not sleeping, not leaving, only sitting there inside the weak light he had brought, keeping watch so that this small center could stay alive for one more night. 3 nights later, Josie was jolted awake by the sound of breaking glass. Not the sound of glass falling and shattering, the sound of glass being struck, heavy, deliberate, followed by the clang of something metal hitting a wall. She sat upright in bed, heart racing, every nerve in her ears stretched tight. A second crash, from the ground floor. Then the sound of tables and chairs being overturned, the hiss of spray paint, fast footsteps moving across the tile floor. Josie looked at the clock. 2:17 in the morning. The residents had all gone upstairs to sleep long ago. At this hour, no one was on the ground floor. She reached for her phone and called Merritt. It rang twice. "Someone is wrecking the first floor. Lock your room. Stay inside. Don't come down." She could hear that he was already out of bed and moving. The sound of car keys. The sound of Walsh being called. Then Merritt added one more sentence before hanging up. 20 minutes. Josie ended the call. She didn't lock her room. She stood at the head of the second floor stairs and looked down. Darkness filled the first floor, and inside that darkness, she saw the beam of a flashlight sweeping across the wall. The spray paint kept hissing. More things were being smashed. Then everything stopped. Running footsteps toward the back door. The sound of an engine starting, tires on wet pavement, then silence. Josie stood at the top of the stairs in the quiet, listening to her own heartbeat, waiting. Merritt arrived in exactly 20 minutes. He and Walsh came through the front entrance, where the glass door had been smashed in, shards crunching under their shoes. Walsh switched on a flashlight. The beam moved across the first floor, and Josie saw everything. The common room had been torn apart. Tables and chairs lay scattered. The bookshelf she and Merritt had just repaired had been dragged down, books thrown all over the floor. The wall had been sprayed with red paint, huge jagged letters that Josie didn't bother reading. The front glass had been completely shattered, the night wind blowing in sharp and cold. The bulletin board she had put up in the hallway had been ripped to pieces, but no one was hurt. The residents were still upstairs. No one had come down. That was the only thing left intact. Merritt stood in the middle of the common room and looked around. His face showed nothing, but Josie could see the way his hands tightened along his sides, the knuckles pale in the flashlight beam. He looked at each thing in turn. The fallen shelf, the paint on the wall, the broken glass. He looked like a man counting wounds. Walsh had already gone to the security monitor in the corner of the room. Merritt had installed the camera system after Ford began applying pressure. 4 small cameras in the 4 corners of the ground floor, recording constantly to a hard drive. Walsh rewound the footage. The video came up, blurry but clear enough. 3 men, faces uncovered, moving fast, organized, smash, overturn, spray, then leave. Walsh studied it, then turned to Merritt. His voice was low, steady, familiar. "I know who they are. Give me 2 hours. Merritt almost nodded. Josie saw the nod begin to form in his throat, the slight lift of his chin, the way his eyes narrowed with the instinct of the last 8 years. Someone touched what belonged to him, he struck back. That was the rule. That was how his world worked. Then he looked up at the staircase. Josie was standing there, on the 4th step from the top, one hand resting on the railing, looking down. She didn't say don't. She didn't shake her head. She didn't plead. She only looked at him and asked one question. What would Attorney Merritt Kane do now? The question fell into the room like a stone dropped into still water. Walsh stood motionless. Merritt stood motionless. The wind blew through the shattered front glass. The generator in the corner kept humming steadily, the only answer filling the silence. Merritt looked at Josie, looked at Walsh, looked back at the monitor where the 3 figures remained frozen on the screen. Back up all the footage, he said. His voice was slow, each word deliberate, like a man listening to himself speak to make sure he truly meant it. Send it to Kendrick. Walsh waited. He knew that wasn't all. And call the police. Walsh looked at him. Looked for a long time. In the 8 years Walsh had followed Merritt Kane, he had never heard those 2 words come from his boss's mouth. The police. In their world, that was a word no one said. Ever. For any reason. The police, Walsh repeated. Not because he hadn't heard, but because he needed to be sure. Call the police. We have evidence. We have video. They can be identified. This time we use the law. Walsh looked at him for 1 beat more. Then he nodded slowly, pulled out his phone, and dialed the 3 numbers he hadn't touched in 8 years. Merritt stepped over the broken glass, went outside through the front entrance, and sat down on the front steps of the center. The steps were cold. The street was dark. No cars, no people. Only the flickering streetlight at the end of the block, and the sound of wind pushing plastic trash across the pavement. Josie came out and sat down beside him. She didn't ask anything. She didn't say you did the right thing. She didn't say a word. They sat side by side on the steps of the damaged building, in the middle of the night, in the darkest neighborhood in Detroit, and neither of them spoke. But both of them knew that what had just happened in the common room wasn't only a decision about the center. It was a decision about the kind of man Merritt Kane wanted to become, and for the first time in 8 years, he had chosen. Far away, the sound of police sirens began to rise, growing closer with every passing second. News spread through the underworld faster than any article ever could. No social media, no reporters. Just one sentence passed from one mouth to another ear. Kane called the police. 4 words, enough to change everything. In the world Merritt had lived in for the past 8 years, there were rules no one ever wrote down but everyone knew. You didn't talk to the police. Ever. Not if you were robbed. Not if your place was smashed. Not if you were threatened. You handled it yourself, or you didn't handle it at all. But you never called those 3 numbers. That wasn't a suggestion. It was law. And Merritt Kane had just broken that law in front of Walsh, in front of the security cameras, in front of a police record that listed him as the owner of the building. The consequences came within a week. Garza cut off contact. Not one call, not one message, only silence. The second partner pulled out of an ongoing deal without explanation. Merritt's own men began looking at him differently. Not with respect, with suspicion. The kind of look reserved for a man they were no longer sure stood on the same side as they did. Merritt saw all of it. He had lived in this world long enough to know what silence meant, and that sometimes the absence of a phone call spoke louder than any threat. The empire he had built over 8 years was cracking, not from the outside, but from within, from his own decision. Walsh came to see Merritt that evening. Not in the VIP room downtown, not in the office behind the dry cleaner. At Merritt's apartment, where he lived alone, where Walsh only came when something truly mattered. Merritt opened the door. Walsh stepped inside and didn't sit down. He stood in the middle of the living room, his arms at his sides, looking at his boss with the same eyes that for 8 years had held nothing but loyalty. But tonight there was something else in them. Worry. You're losing everything you built over the last 8 years. Merritt stood by the window, his back to Walsh. I know. Garza isn't speaking to you anymore. Your men are starting to wonder whether you can still be trusted. The Northern deal has already collapsed. I know. They don't spare men who break the rules, Merritt. You know that better than anyone. Today it's silence. Tomorrow it could be something else. I know. Walsh stopped, took a breath. then asked the question he had been holding inside ever since the night he heard police sirens on the streets of the East Side. "So you still choose that center?" Merritt turned and looked at Walsh, and for the first time in the 8 years Walsh had known him, Merritt Kane looked at him with eyes that had no walls standing behind them. "I'm not choosing the center," Merritt said, each word slow, like a man speaking something he had only just understood. "I'm choosing to stop being the man I hate." Walsh stood still. The room stood still. The sounds of the city outside the window seemed far away, as if they belonged to some other world. 8 years, Merritt continued, his voice softer now. "For 8 years I built an empire to prove that the law meant nothing, that power and money were the only things that could protect anyone. And then she walked into that center, fixed a leaking faucet, cleaned out a storage room, and showed me that I was wrong. Not with words, by the way she lived." Walsh said nothing. He waited. "I don't know what happens next, but I know I don't want to sit in a VIP room listening to people call me boss while inside. I know I'm a coward who ran from himself." The silence stretched on. Walsh looked at Merritt, looked at him for a long time. Then he did something he had never done in 8 years. He sat down. Not because he was tired, but because this was no longer a conversation between a boss and a subordinate. It was between two human beings. "Then I stay with you." Merritt looked at him. "Why? Everything is collapsing. There's nothing in it for Walsh, if he stays with me." "Because I never followed you for money," Walsh said, his voice even, unwavering. "Never did." Merritt looked at the man who had walked beside him for 8 years, the man who opened car doors for him, who sent envelopes to Rosa, who knew when to stand silent and when to speak at exactly the moment Merritt needed to hear something. Walsh wasn't a subordinate. He had never been only that. "Thank you," Merritt said. 2 words he couldn't remember the last time he had spoken. Walsh nodded, stood up, and buttoned his coat. "I'll handle the rest. You take care of the center." He walked to the door. Before closing it, he stopped. He didn't turn around. "It's been a long time since I've seen you look like yourself." The door closed. Merritt stood alone in the empty apartment. Outside, the city of Detroit kept moving, kept roaring, kept living. But the world he had built over 8 years was coming apart piece by piece, and he stood there watching it fall without trying to hold it together. And for the first time in 8 years, he felt lighter. The center was patched back together in 3 days. Josie and the few residents who remained swept up broken glass, set the tables and chairs upright again, and painted over the words on the walls. It wasn't beautiful, but it could stand. The front glass door was replaced with a sheet of plywood, and less light came into the common room than before, but there was still enough to see one another. And seeing one another was what Josie needed now. She spent 2 days knocking on doors all across the East Side, not begging, just telling the truth. Creston was swallowing the neighborhood. The center had been attacked. If people didn't stand up now, there wouldn't be another chance. She invited everyone to come to the center on Saturday night. Whoever wanted to come could come. Whoever didn't, she understood. On Saturday evening, Josie stood at the entrance of the center and counted. 5 people, 10, 15, 20. In the end, around 30 people sat on plastic chairs arranged in rows in the common room. Some she recognized, Mrs. Morales with her granddaughter, Mr. Henderson, several residents from the center. Some she had never met before, neighbors from the surrounding blocks, the owner of the laundromat on the corner, a young couple renting a place near the far end of the neighborhood. They hadn't come because they believed. They had come because they were afraid. And sometimes fear was enough to pull people out of their homes. Josie stood in front of them. No podium, no microphone. She simply stood in the open space between the first row of chairs and the wall that had just been repainted. "I won't speak long," she said. "You all know what's happening. Creston wants this neighborhood. They buy land, pressure people to sell, use lawyers to force us out. Last week they sent people to destroy this center." She pointed to the wall behind her, where the new paint still held a sheen. "This isn't just my fight. It belongs to everyone sitting here. If we don't stand up now, no one is going to stand up for us." Silence. 30 faces looked at her. Some nodded, some looked down. One man in the back row folded his arms, his face doubtful. Then Merritt walked in. He came from the back entrance, moving slowly, unhurried. No black suit, no Walsh behind him. He wore a plain jacket, jeans, worn shoes. He looked like any other man on the East Side, except for the way everyone in the room turned to look at him. They knew him, or knew of him. No introduction was needed. Merritt stepped to the front and stood beside Josie. She looked at him, gave a slight nod, then stepped back one pace. The floor was his now. Merritt looked at the 30 faces watching him. He saw fear in some, suspicion in others, curiosity in a few, and in the back row, the man with folded arms was staring at him with the look Merritt had known his whole life. The look of a man who believed he was dangerous. "Most of you know who I am," Merritt said. His voice was neither loud nor soft, only steady enough for everyone in the room to hear clearly. "Or you think you do. I'm the one who has paid for this center for 8 years. That money didn't come from a clean place. I'm not standing here to ask your forgiveness for that." The man in the back row stood up. "Then why are you standing here?" "So we're supposed to trust a crime boss. Trust that you care about this neighborhood." Merritt looked directly into the man's eyes. No anger, no defense. "No. I'm not standing here so you'll trust me." Silence. "I'm standing here because before I became the man you think I am, I used to fight for people like you. People about to lose their homes, their neighborhood, everything. Because someone with more money decided their land was worth more than their lives." He paused, took a breath. "I lost, and I ran. For 8 years, this center is the only thing I have not been ashamed of. It is the only thing in 8 years that I can look at without wanting to turn my face away." The room was silent. 30 people silent. The generator in the corner kept humming, low and patient. "I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to trust this place, to believe that it is worth keeping. And if you believe that, then stand with me. Not for me, for yourselves." The silence stretched on. Then movement came. The man in the back row shook his head, stood, and walked to the door. 2 people followed him, then a few more. Plastic chairs creaked as they rose. Footsteps crossed the tile floor. The door opened and closed. But not everyone left. Mrs. Morales stayed seated, her hand gripping her granddaughter's tightly. "Mr." Henderson nodded, slow but clear. A young mother Josie had never seen before, holding a small child in her arms, spoke loudly enough for the room to hear. "I'm staying." An old man in the corner, silent from the beginning, gave one single nod. One by one. Not many. About 15. But 15 people who stayed after hearing the truth. 15 people who didn't walk away. That was something Merritt had never had before. He stepped down, moved out of the open space in the room, and went toward the hallway. His hand was trembling slightly. Josie saw it. She followed him. "Are you all right?" Merritt stopped. He didn't fully turn. He only tilted his head enough to look at her over his shoulder. "No," he said. His voice was low, faintly rough. "But I'm still standing here. That's enough." Josie looked at him for another beat. Then she nodded, only slightly, and turned back toward the common room, where 15 people were sitting and waiting to learn what came next. 3 days after the community meeting, Kendrick called Merritt. "There's someone who wants to meet you. A lawyer. She read my article and reached out on her own. Her name is Pamela Oakes. She specializes in community rights, and she has won 2 cases against real estate corporations in Chicago. She wants to help." Merritt met Pamela at the center. She came alone. No assistant, no oversized briefcase, just a laptop and a thin notebook. Around 40, hair pinned neatly up, sharp eyes, the kind of eyes that had sat across from corporate legal teams enough times to no longer be impressed by expensive suits and confident voices. "I read Kendrick Shaw's article," Pamela said as she sat down at the table across from Merritt. "Creston is using the exact same playbook I saw in Chicago. Shell companies, fast-tracked approvals, lawyers pressuring residents. But this time they have a weakness. The redevelopment approval process skipped the community impact review. If we can prove that before the board, we can stop the project." "We?" Merritt asked. "I'm offering to represent the East Side community. Pro bono. Why? Because I hate corporations like Creston. And because I've read enough about this case to know it's worth fighting." Pamela looked straight at Merritt. "You know the law. I read your old record. Juris Doctor, Michigan. Why do you need me?" "Because I can't appear as counsel anymore. But I can help build the argument." Pamela nodded. She didn't ask anything more about his past. She didn't ask why he no longer practiced. She was the kind of lawyer who cared about the case, not the personal history of the person working beside her. Then let's get to work. They started that same afternoon. Pamela built the legal framework, identified the weak points in Creston's approval record, and drafted a list of witnesses they would need to call. And Merritt, for the first time in 10 years, opened law books again. Not the old books in the basement. New ones. He ordered them online, had them delivered to the center within 2 days. 4 thick volumes on urban planning law and property rights. Josie saw him sitting at the table in the common room at night, after the residents had gone upstairs, the generator light casting a yellow glow across the open pages. He read, wrote notes in the margins, marked pages, searched case law. His eyes moved across each line with the speed of a man who had once known this language, once breathed inside this language, then abandoned it, and was now finding his way back word by word. Josie watched him from her doorway and saw something she had never seen in Merritt Kane before. His eyes were bright, not bright with anger or power, bright because he was doing the thing he had been born to do. During the day, Josie did her part. She met with each of the remaining residents, sat down with them, and wrote out their stories. Not grand stories, simple ones. Mr. Henderson said he had come to the center after losing his job, had been helped with rewriting his resume, and found new work within a month. Mrs. Morales said her granddaughter had been taught by Josie how to read a lease agreement, and had spotted an unfair clause that nearly cost her the room. A young woman named Diane said she had come to the center last winter with only 2 sets of clothes on her back, and this had been the first place that gave her a bed, without asking for anything in return. Josie wrote down all of it, every sentence, every name. Evidence isn't always numbers and contracts. Sometimes evidence is simply a human being telling the story of the moment they had nothing left, and someone stood beside them. Kendrick called on the 5th day. His voice was tighter than usual. I've got more evidence. Internal Creston emails. Ford knew the Lakefront Holdings land purchase had legal problems, and still pushed it through. It's written clearly in an email sent to the board. Enough for a hearing? Merritt asked. More than enough. Pamela filed a request for a hearing before the city planning board. The hearing was scheduled within 10 days. On the night before the hearing, Merritt and Josie sat in the common room. Documents were spread all across the table. Resident testimony transcripts, printed Creston emails, Pamela's legal analysis, Merritt's handwritten notes. The generator light still burned yellow. Outside, the east side was dark and still. Are you ready? Josie asked. Merritt looked at the pile of papers on the table, looked at the law book open to the last page he had marked, looked at Josie. No, he said. But I'm not running anymore. Josie nodded. She reached out and began gathering the documents, stacking them into neat piles, sliding them into the case. Merritt helped her. They worked in silence, 2 people preparing for the next morning without knowing how it would end. But this time, neither of them ran before it began. The hearing room was on the 3rd floor of Detroit City Hall, a wide chamber with a high ceiling, oak-paneled walls, and fluorescent lights cast evenly over rows of chairs, arranged in 2 sections facing one another. On the right, Creston Development's team sat polished and composed like the cover of a corporate magazine. 4 lawyers, each with a thick case binder, a planning expert with a laptop already open to a 3-dimensional map, and Nolan Ford, seated in the back row in his familiar gray suit, wearing that same familiar faint smile, the confidence of a man who believed he knew the outcome before the contest had even begun. On the left, Pamela Oak sat at the head of the row with her notebook and slim case. Behind her sat Merritt, Josie, and 15 East Side residents on the same plastic chairs they had brought from the center because the hearing room didn't have enough seating. The city planning board consisted of 5 people seated behind a long table at the front, facing both sides. The chairperson struck the gavel and declared the hearing open. Creston presented first. Their lead attorney stood, turned on the projector, and delivered the presentation in the polished voice of someone who had practiced it to perfection. The redevelopment map filled the screen, the east side colored in bright green, with modern housing, retail centers, parks, and new infrastructure. A bar graph showed projected jobs, tax revenue for the city, and neighborhood property values rising 4-fold within 5 years. Every number was spoken with absolute confidence, as if the future had already been decided and this hearing were nothing more than a formality. Then Pamela stood. No projector, no charts, only her voice and her evidence. Members of the board, Creston Development's project looks beautiful on paper. But paper never tells the whole story. She opened her notebook. The approval record for the East Side redevelopment was signed in record time, while skipping 3 community impact review steps required by city law. 2 members of the approving board received consulting fees from a company directly tied to Creston. She placed a stack of documents on the board's table. These are internal Creston emails, in which CEO Nolan Ford admits that he knew the land purchase through the shell company Lakefront Holdings had legal problems, yet still directed that it move forward. Ford sat in the back row, and for the first time his smile disappeared. The chairperson looked through the documents, face unreadable. "Do you have witnesses?" "Yes, Madam Chair." One by one, the residents took the stand. Mr. Henderson stood before the board, both hands gripping the witness chair. "I came to the East Side Center after losing my job. They helped me rewrite my resume, and I found new work within a month. Without that place, I don't know where I'd be now." Diane, the young woman who had arrived at the center last winter, spoke more briefly. "I came there with 2 sets of clothes. They gave me a place to sleep without asking for anything. For the first time in my life, I had somewhere to stay where I didn't have to be afraid." Mrs. Morales didn't say much. She said only one sentence. "My granddaughter learned to read contracts at the center. Because of that, she caught the clause they were using to cheat me out of my room. If the center is lost, people like us lose the last place left that we can trust." No one performed. No one read from a prepared speech. They simply told what had happened to them, in voices that trembled or stayed steady, with eyes lowered or lifted straight ahead. But all of it was real. Then Pamela called the last witness before Josie. "I call Mr. Merritt Kane." Merritt stood. The 15 residents watched him walk forward. Ford watched him. Creston's lawyers watched him. The board watched him. And Merritt Kane sat in the witness chair, placed both hands on the table, and spoke. "I am the owner of the East Side Community Center building. I established that place 8 years ago. 10 years ago, I was a lawyer. I took a case to defend a community. I promised I would win, and I lost. After that, I gave up. I left the law. I left everything. For 8 years, I believed the law was a fraud, that money and power always won, that people like me had no place in this system." He paused, looked directly at the 5 members of the board. "I was wrong. The law is not a fraud. The law only fails when no one is left who dares to use it. I am standing here today because I'm not running anymore, and because the people sitting behind me deserve to have someone stand with them." Creston's lead attorney rose to cross-examine him. He was the kind of lawyer who had done this long enough to know exactly how to find a crack and widen it. "Mr. Kane, you said you established the center 8 years ago. Where did the funding to maintain that center come from?" "From me. From what income source?" Merritt looked directly into the lawyer's eyes. "That money didn't come from a place I'm proud of." The lawyer raised an eyebrow. "Can you be more specific?" "I can. But that is not relevant to this hearing. This hearing concerns Creston Development's approval process, not my personal finances." Pamela rose at once. "Objection. Relevance. The question has nothing to do with the subject of this hearing." The chairperson nodded, sustained. "Counsel for Creston, stay within scope." Creston's lawyer didn't give up easily. "Then, Mr. Kane, why should this board trust the word of a man who admits his income source is not transparent?" Merritt didn't look at the lawyer. He looked at the board. "Because that center is the one thing I am not ashamed of. And the people sitting behind me, they don't care where the money came from. They care who stood beside them when no one else did. You may doubt me, but you cannot doubt them." The hearing room went silent. Not the silence of indifference, the silence of people hearing something they had not prepared an answer for. Pamela rose into the silence Merritt had left behind. "Members of the board, I call the final witness, Josie Warren." Josie stood from the back row. The 15 residents watched her. Merritt watched her. She walked down the aisle between the 2 sections of chairs, old shoes against the polished wooden floor, and took the witness seat Merritt had just left. It was still warm. She placed both hands on the table. They didn't tremble. Her eyes looked straight at the board. Not down, not toward Merritt, not toward Ford or Creston's legal team. Straight at the 5 people who would decide the fate of the place she called home. "I grew up without a family," Josie said. Her voice was steady, unshaken. But something lay beneath that steadiness that everyone in the room could hear. The foster care system. One house after another. No family was ever forever. I don't remember the faces of most of the people who took me in. And they don't remember mine either. She paused for a beat, not to catch her breath, but because this was the first time she had ever said these things in front of strangers. No one ever taught me that I deserved a place to come back to. I grew up believing I was temporary, staying temporarily, living temporarily, belonging temporarily, then leaving. The hearing room was silent. Not silent out of politeness, silent because no one knew what to say. I came to the East Side Center on an October night. No money, no family, nowhere else in this world left to go. I stood in front of that door and thought this would probably be the 100th temporary place in my life. She lowered her eyes to the table for a second, then lifted them again. The manager opened the door, let me in, didn't ask a single question, didn't ask where I came from, what I had done, whether I had money. She just opened the door. Her voice stayed even, but something frayed softly at the edges. Not weakness, truth. That place wasn't beautiful. The ceiling leaked, the faucet dripped, chairs had broken legs, but it was the first place in 27 years that made me feel I belonged somewhere, that I wasn't temporary, that there was a place in this world where, when I walked in, no one asked how long I would be staying. Mrs. Morales in the back row lifted a hand to cover her mouth. Mr. Henderson looked down at the floor. "If you take that place away," Josie said, and now she looked directly at each board member one by one, "you are not only tearing down a building, you are telling people like me that we do not deserve a place to stand. That the ground beneath us only has value when someone richer wants to build something else on top of it." Silence. Long. Heavy. The chairperson looked at Josie without writing anything down. Creston's lead attorney stood up. He knew he had to say something. He had to break this moment before it settled too deeply into the minds of the board. "Miss Warren, how long have you lived at the center?" "A few months." "And before that, where did you live?" "A lot of places. Do you have any expertise in urban planning, regional economics, or infrastructure development?" "No." "Then on what basis do you evaluate the value of an urban redevelopment project?" Josie looked directly into his eyes. "I don't have expertise in planning, but I do have expertise in having nowhere to go, and I can assure you, you do not." The lawyer opened his mouth, then closed it again. He sat down. Not because he had run out of arguments, but because he was smart enough to know that anything else he said would only make him look worse. The chairperson struck the gavel. "The board will recess to review all evidence and testimony. This hearing is temporarily adjourned." 2 hours of waiting. Josie sat in the hallway of City Hall, her back against the wall, eyes on the ceiling. Merritt sat beside her without speaking. The 15 residents were scattered across the plastic chairs along the hallway, some whispering to one another, some sitting in silence, some pacing. Walsh stood at the far end of the hallway, with his hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. Pamela sat on a windowsill rereading her notes, a pencil tapping lightly against her notebook. 2 hours. Longer than any 2 hours Josie had ever lived through. Then the hearing room door opened. The board clerk stepped out. "Everyone, please come back in." They returned to their seats. The 5 board members sat again at the front table. The chairperson opened the file and read, "The board has reviewed all evidence and testimony from both parties. Creston Development's redevelopment proposal for the East Side area, including the site of the community center building, is denied." A breath broke somewhere behind Josie. Someone inhaled sharply. "Reason. The original approval process shows signs of impropriety, including the omission of required community impact review and unresolved financial ties between approving board members and Creston Development. The board orders an immediate suspension of the entire East Side project until the investigation is complete." The room broke apart. Not with cheering, only with breath, chairs scraping, people embracing, someone crying while trying to hide it. The 15 people stood at once without anyone telling them to. Mrs. Morales wrapped her arms around her granddaughter. "Mr." Henderson pressed a hand to his chest and breathed. Diane stood motionless, tears running down her face, without wiping them away. Ford sat in Creston's section, pale as paper. The legal team gathered their files in silence. Outside City Hall, afternoon sunlight spilled across the steps. Residents stood in small clusters, talking, embracing, smiling with red eyes. Kendrick stood off to one side with his notebook open, writing. Pamela walked over to Merritt and held out her hand. "You're still a good lawyer. You just forgot." Merritt shook her hand. Then he looked toward the steps, where Josie stood alone, apart from the crowd. She wasn't celebrating, wasn't smiling, wasn't talking to anyone. She stood still, eyes red, both hands clenched at her sides, staring out at the street ahead like someone who had just finished running a very long distance and still couldn't believe she had reached the end. This wasn't a permanent victory. Josie knew that. A suspension order wasn't a permanent ban. The investigation could drag on, or it could lead nowhere. Creston had money, lawyers, patience. But today, 15 people had stood up. Today, a hearing room had heard their voices. And today, for the first time in 27 years, Josie Warren had spoken aloud the thing she had carried inside all her life, and someone had listened. That was enough. For today, that was enough. The investigation lasted 3 months. The outcome surprised no one who had read Kendrick Shaw's article. 2 officials on the Planning Approval Board were confirmed to have received money from a company tied to Creston. Internal emails proved that Ford knew and gave the orders. Both officials were suspended. Ford was forced by Creston's board of directors to resign in a closed-door meeting with no press release, only a short line on the company's website. Nolan Ford is stepping down as CEO to pursue other opportunities. Creston withdrew from the east side. No noise, no apology. They simply disappeared, the same way they had arrived, as if this neighborhood had never been on their map at all. The East Side Community Center was still standing. The plywood board that had replaced the glass door was gone, replaced by new glass. The walls had been painted again. The bookshelf had been fully repaired. The generator was no longer needed because the power had been restored. And the front door opened every morning at 6 o'clock sharp, just as it had opened for the past 8 years, even though there had been a time when it seemed it might never open again. 6 months after the hearing, Merritt Kane began to withdraw from the world he had lived in for 8 years. No announcement, no dramatic break. He simply handed things over, piece by piece, relationship by relationship, responsibility by responsibility, until the name Merritt Kane was no longer attached to any VIP room, any deal, or any territory. Walsh was the last one to receive his handoff, and when it was done, he left too, opened an auto repair garage on the outskirts of Detroit, and lived quietly for the first time in his life. Merritt didn't return to practicing law. He didn't hang up his degree. He didn't open an office. He simply sat each day at the table in the center's common room. The same old wooden table with 4 legs of 4 different heights that Josie had steadied with cardboard, and helped residents read lease agreements, understand insurance rights, fill out job applications, and draft complaint letters when they were being overcharged. No salary, no title. No one called him a lawyer. They just called him Merritt, the man who sat at the corner table and knew how to read the things ordinary people couldn't understand. Josie became the director of the center, officially, with paperwork, with a salary, even if it wasn't much. Rosa retired, but still came every afternoon, sat in her old chair in the kitchen drinking tea, and complained that Josie organized the storage room the wrong way. The center expanded. There were new vocational classes in electrical and plumbing repair taught by Josie herself. There was a free legal support program organized by Merritt and Pamela once a week. There were more temporary beds for the people who came knocking late at night, just as Josie had knocked on that October night. The model was replicated by a non-profit organization in 2 other Detroit neighborhoods, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. One afternoon, nearly a year after the hearing, the front yard of the center had just been redone. There were long wooden benches. There were young trees newly planted, pale green leaves tilting in the evening wind. There was shade, something this neighborhood had never had much of. Children from families in the neighborhood were playing in the yard. Some chased one another around the tree trunks. Some sat on the concrete drawing with chalk. Their laughter filled the air, clear and untroubled, the kind of laughter only children who feel safe know how to make. Merritt sat on the front steps of the center, watching the children play. He sat there the way he had sat at the table in the common room, naturally, as if he belonged there. No suit, no black car, no Walsh standing behind him, just a man sitting on the steps in the late afternoon, watching children at play, and for the first time in a very long while, not wanting to be anywhere else. Josie stepped out through the front door carrying 2 cups of coffee. She sat down beside him, placed 1 cup in his hand, and kept the other for herself. She didn't ask whether he wanted it, just like that morning in the common room, when she had placed the first cup of coffee in front of him and he had drunk it without checking. This time, too, it was the same. They sat beside each other, said nothing. Merritt reached out and took her hand. She let him. They didn't look at each other. They only sat there, their hands clasped together, looking out over the small yard full of laughter that 1 year earlier had been nothing more than an empty patch of ground choked with weeds. Around them were the sounds of children laughing, people talking, the center door opening and closing, the sounds of life. The place that had once been silent like something forgotten was now full of voices. The place a crime boss had paid to keep alive for 8 years without daring to step inside had become the place where he sat every afternoon. The man who had once been unable to walk through that door now sat right on its front steps, holding the hand of the woman who had forced him to open it again, and not because he deserved to be forgiven, but because he had finally stopped running. And sometimes, stopping your flight is the first step toward home. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. If this story touched you, please press like and share this video with a friend you think needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss new stories every day. Let us know how you felt about this story by writing in the comments below, because we always want to hear what rises from the deepest part of your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days, every single day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.